Okay, welcome to Wiggle Soup episode 3. Apologies if you can hear the wind howling away outside. If you can hear it at all, perhaps it will provide some spooky ambiance. Now that we've discussed self-perception and how the idea of individuality gets a little dicey once you look at the biological alternatives out there in nature, I figured I'd draw together these last few episodes of thoughts by talking about the soul, our immaterial inner essence that gives us personhood. In a word, ghosts. I think, therefore I am. Everyone's heard of that, right? This dictum, first coined by French philosopher René Descartes, is familiar to most of us. But what does it mean? It means that something must exist to be having such deep introspective thoughts. More than that, we cannot say. But what does Mr. Descartes mean by I, exactly? What are we referencing when we talk about ourselves? And once we've removed the material, biological body, what aspects of a person might remain? To start, many claim that humans are distinct from the rest of the animal kingdom in that we alone possess an immaterial and immortal soul. This immediately raises the questions, why do only humans possess souls? And at what point in our evolutionary past did we acquire them? There are, of course, religious answers to these questions, but I intend to give them my full attention in future episodes. For now, in the same way that molten rock is called magma when it's underground, but lava by the time it reaches the Earth's surface, a soul is traditionally thought to be contained within a living body, becoming a ghost when it exits. In an attempt to sidestep the hazy conceptual semantics, I'll just call both ghosts for the time being. There is, of course, a case to be made that ghosts don't exist at all, and that our conscious perception of ourselves and what remains evolved naturally as societies became more complex. Nobody knows how this might have happened, though I'll take a crack at it in the next episode. But in the spirit of philosophical discourse, there's a pun in there somewhere, let's grant that ghosts do exist, if only to get the conversation moving. Over the ages, the concept of a person's spiritual ghost has been used in many ways, remaining so ill-defined, flexible, and elusive that to talk about it seems both meaningless and irrefutable. With or without any permeating ethereal essence, when we talk about ourselves, who we are and what we're like, we have to make a whole heap of assumptions. To comprehend ourselves, we intuitively assume that we've existed consistently and continuously throughout our lives, that we've come to know the world through sensory information, and that a suite of cognitive gifts gives us control over our actions. And naturally by us, I mean our ghosts. The problem is, while each assumption appears stupefyingly obvious, they become significantly less evident the more we look into them. For example, our tastes, beliefs, abilities, and values tend to change as life marches on. No great controversy there. And as we've said before, human personalities may need to include a capacity to adapt to whatever social environment we land in. Yet we take for granted that something about us remains constant. If every temporary, culturally variable characteristic were taken away, our tastes, opinions, motives, and ambitions, what would remain? With all that personal, circumstantial fat cut off, would such a minimal self still count as you? This poses an uncomfortable choice. On the one hand, we have a highly reduced but stable sense of self-identity, one that is so far removed from every aspect of your personality that it's barely recognizable. Or, on the other hand, a self that consists of innumerable fluctuating components with no substantive core that persists over time. It's hard to accept, but modern neuroscientific findings point to the latter. Like the links of a chain, our personalities must be composed of many overlapping cognitive processes, lacking any single continuous structure throughout its length. My next question, then, for any disembodied spirit listening in: how can the material world interact with and affect an immaterial ghost? And, as age, intoxication, injury, sensory deprivation, and education can all alter a person's personality, what exactly does a ghost contribute? What are they useful for? If you happen to be a ghost or are in direct correspondence with one, please, answers in the comments. Just as spirits cause problems for brains in the alcoholic sense, brains create numerous problems for spirits in the philosophical sense. Much of what we assume about our inner lives, from visual perception to memory, is in fact constructed by the mind retrospectively. The same brain science that demolishes the indivisible self also reveals that sights and sounds become available to the brain at different times. This is pretty cool. Limitations in our sensory processing mean that hearing a voice and watching the speaker's lips move must be artificially constructed by the brain before we become consciously aware of it. If sights, sounds, smells, feelings, and mental recollections were not seamlessly merged together to preserve their apparent simultaneity, nothing would make sense. We need cause and effect to keep track of ourselves. The illusion of reality, as we perceive it, certainly complicates a person's subjective identity. Next against the wall is the common sense view that our sense of self is positioned in the present. With different sensory inputs arriving at different speeds, the brain needs to blur the lines a bit to weave a coherent picture. Minute but inescapable delays mean that our conscious present moment is never strictly live. According to neuroscientist and a personal science hero of mine, David Eagleman, our consciousness lags around 80 milliseconds behind actual events. Not only this, but experiments in cognitive psychology expose our brain's habit of filling in missing information with guesswork. Oh yes, we frequently assemble coherent narratives that never actually took place. And why not? With visual stimuli taking its sweet time to come in, compared to hearing, say, our brains are forced to compensate and predict where things will be one moment after the next. Rather than extrapolating events in the future, this involves our brains interpolating events in the past. What a shambles! If the moment of time we're inhabiting is a mental construct, the same is likely to be true of our sense of self at any time in the past, present, or future. We simply can't know which bits of ourselves actually exist, or when. We just have this feeling that we are a gloriously intelligible whole. So ghosts, answer me this. How is it that a person's naked soul or free-roaming spirit can perceive anything of the material world? If a ghost can see, hear, touch, think, feel, and/or speak after death, without the need of a physical body, why on earth do we inhabit such bewilderingly complex organic machines while we're alive? With no certainty over who or when we are, any lingering belief that we are an agent, the locus of control, gets sketchier. Just as our perceptions can be fudged, psychologists have long known that our minds conjure justifications for our behaviours that lack any factual basis. These studies are as fascinating as they are amusing, or in the case of patients with split brain syndrome, often very sad. Intentional reasoning may not be brought about by our conscious selves at all. By predicting a subject's decisions before they're made, researchers have famously shown that, in some cases, our brains can make up their minds a full 10 seconds before we know about it. Any apparent illusion of control may be a reflexive effort by our brain to ease confusion via fabricated autobiographical narratives. In other words, consciousness is a spin doctor. None of this is to say that brains don't think things, decide things, and instruct the body. After all, our entire way of life relies on the assertion that we are unchanging, sensible, autonomous individuals. But if the environment we're interacting with is even a little bit made up, the self, too, may only be an illusion of convenience. If the flawed and patchy information gathered by our senses were presented to our conscious minds unedited, the cacophony of distracting inconsistencies would be disastrous for survival. Humans are, therefore, committed to feeling as if they possess some irreducible and dependable inner essence and deliberate control of their actions. As you may have guessed, I am not personally convinced that ghosts are real. Although the questions that I'm asking are not arguments in themselves, they do draw attention to doubts. So where might a believer's assurance come from? Interestingly, there's no pan-cultural concept of selfhood. The concept of a self remains almost as mysterious as the concept of a ghost. The two terms can be used interchangeably, along with souls and spirits. So far, my questions have been aimed at ghosts, while my discussion has been focused on the self. I make no apologies for this, but a distinction should be made. The possible existence of a tangible self, while philosophically dubious, is at least brave enough to invite scientific investigation. I think, therefore I am relies on the current existence of an essential, continuous, persisting self, which empirical evidence incriminates as an illusion. A person's true ghost, on the other hand, would be immaterial and supernatural by definition, and therefore stubbornly beyond examination. This begs the question: if we do have ghosts, or souls, how can anyone know that they live on after a person's death? Over 100 billion people have lived and died throughout human history to date, yet nobody's self has ever made a verifiable comeback. And chances are, neither will we, at least not convincingly. If the brain creates the self, and the self inspires ghosts, the mystery remains a scientific one at the cost of any life after death. If there is an immaterial component to human existence, and that ghost can be forcibly ejected by electric shock or impact or insufficient oxygen while the body remains otherwise intact, that still doesn't explain why do we only get one ghost per person? I know the question sounds absurd as I say it, but why? As much as I relish the role of devil's advocate in these discussions, conventional ideas about souls don't account for half the things they're supposed to. If, like atoms, a consortium of souls took residence within each person, inner conflicts, mood swings, and a range of other over-the-counter emotional turmoil would finally have a supernatural explanation. Instead, one indecisive and highly temperamental spiritual essence is all we get. This also seems rather wasteful. Just as each molecule of your body once belonged to something else, the air, your food, parental contributions, etc., why don't immaterial ghosts get recycled when we die? Everlasting batteries could be used in an infinite succession of appliances. Isn't it odd that an infinite soul gets retired after just one use? Even allowing for the possibility of reincarnation, it occurs to me that if we had a ghost, we wouldn't need such a large, fragile, flawed, and energy-hungry brain to generate our self-awareness. I see no reason why an immaterial spirit wouldn't bestow an unshakably fully functioning mind all the time, impervious to drugs or trauma. Admittedly, this is an argument from personal incredulity. Even so, the fact that our brains are so intricate and develop in a smooth continuum from non-conscious sperm and egg convinces me that only biological wetware can naturally give rise to consciousness. No matter how flimsy our definitions are, in every case and from every angle, the rationale for the concept of ghosts flatlines just slightly ahead of the concept of the self. With Halloween fast approaching, next episode we'll take a look at death and humanity's evolving cultural attitudes towards it. As Peter Pan remarked in the movie Hook, to die would be a great adventure.